This morning I talked about the fact that there wasn't a PM outline. And what ends up happening, I have a practice at Saturday night. I have last night here on my paper. So Saturday night, I get everything finalized and put together. My sermons have been done, and Trisha's printing the bulletin, and I'm usually printing my outlines. And if I come to a point where I don't feel like the outline is going to stay the same Sunday night, I generally don't include it because it seems contradictory, because it seems like it will cause more problems than it will solve. And especially when it comes to the Song of Solomon, considering it is such a delicate topic to preach, I wanted to make especially sure that my written outline and my spoken sermon were in concert, and that we were all on the same page, so to speak. And so I always want to make sure that I'm positive that it's going to stay the same through my study on Sunday afternoon. And I wasn't sure about that. There were some things swirling around. Actually, I had 2 or 3 different outlines I was considering, because there is so much here, and there are so many important lessons from the Song of Solomon, and it is a true shame that the book altogether is oftentimes ignored. The Song of Solomon is an incredible book, and for a number of reasons. One in particular, if you have a significant other, a wife or a husband, I would encourage you from time to time to read the Song of Solomon. Much of the Song of Solomon is, as we talked about last week, or a couple of weeks ago actually, it's been a little while since we've been here. But the Song of Solomon is almost a ballad. It's a play, a musical, right? One individual described it as an opera, and that didn't connect with me at all. I have no idea what operas are like, other than people are singing very loud, and usually very well, I think. But a musical was incredibly apt, because the Song of Solomon is obviously a series of songs. Not necessarily intended to be sung, but poetry. And a discussion between a husband and his wife, and these young lovers. And as they will develop their relationship, it can be, at times, it can feel awkward to watch, to see. And what you will find as you read through the Song of Solomon, especially with your significant other, you will find euphemisms from time to time. You will find discussions on things that as a group I don't plan on talking about for obvious reasons, but things that will help you to see the significance of a marital relationship, especially the sexual components of a marital relationship and what they can mean to 2 individuals who are married. And you notice I've said that word married a number of times, and that's important. And I find it incredibly interesting that that's actually our second point tonight. For now, the first point. The first point has to do, obviously, with the respect for marriage. And the Song of Solomon is implicit on how important your respect for the marriage is. And that seems weird, I know, considering Solomon's situation following this. It is believed that this is his first wife. And he has come to a new realization on life. And he is beginning, as we described a few weeks ago, that young love. That overzealous love that some of us look upon and we say, wow, that's hard to watch. People who care about each other and speak it out loud, even in public settings, and show sometimes more affection to one another than we are oftentimes accustomed to. And I wonder if that's not necessarily because we have become hardened to it, because we think that love as it matures should change. But I've seen old people who sat together in a rocking chair and stared into each other's eyes and told each other that they loved each other. And their marriage worked, not simply because of that, but that was a big part of it. And so the first part and the first thing that I notice in the Song of Solomon altogether is their willingness to communicate. In verses 9 and then 12 through 16, they compliment rather than criticize. In verse 9 he says, I have compared you, my love, to my filly among Pharaoh's chariots. He says, you could take me to Pharaoh's household, and you could show me his stables, and I would choose you over all of them. Now, he is using metaphor here, obviously. She is not a horse. And some women this would work for them. This would make sense to them. There are some analogies you just don't make, but in this context and in her understanding, comparing her to a filly, a horse, a beautiful horse, it makes sense, and she appreciates that. So compliment in ways that are appreciated by the other person, that's an important aspect. But communication is in some part compliment. Now there are times where we should challenge one another and we should talk to one another, and there are times that criticism is important, necessary even. But notice in verse 12 of chapter 1, we're going to cover the last half of chapter 1 and the first half of chapter 2. He says there in verse 12, while the king is at his table, my spikenard sends forth its fragrance. She says, a bundle of myrrh is my beloved to me. Notice what she says. A bundle of myrrh is my beloved to me, that lies all night between my breasts. My beloved is to me a cluster of henna blossoms in the vineyards of Engadi. She's saying how enraptured she is about him, and especially this bundle of myrrh. It was customary for especially wealthy women could do it, but a lot of women did it as they could. They would wear overnight a satchel, a package, a small bundle of fragrant spices. And the idea was that that fragrant spice would exude effectively into their skin. And you do this, I did this when my daughter was sick. I took some Vicks and I rubbed it on her feet, because your feet are one of the warmest places of your body. And I don't know why it works. When I was a kid, my mom would shove it up my nose, and that was not pleasant. You're welcome, I don't do that. But that's what she's talking about here. It's not in the directive sense a sensual thing. She's talking about how he is this thing that makes her life worth living, that makes her life slightly sweeter than it was before. That is amazing. What an astounding compliment she pays to her beloved, that his existence, his mere existence, gives her incredible joy. And then the Shulamite, he says, behold, you are handsome, my beloved. Yes, pleasant also. Our bed is green, and the beams of our houses are cedar, and our rafters of fir. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But you see this compliment that's coming from her, and this encouragement that you will see from him as well, this shared commitment to reassuring one another in your love. Communication is necessary. It's important. And it's not just about saying things that sound nice. It's about saying things first that you mean, and then that are communicated well to the other person, because a compliment to one person wouldn't so much be a compliment to another, and we should respect that and understand that. And as you grow as a couple, you will understand that more and more, so much so that you see some elderly couples, again, will make jokes towards each other, and you would say, wow, that was harsh, or that seemed rude, but it's some inside joke. And to them, it's a statement of affection. And it doesn't have to be understood by everyone. Displays of affection don't have to always be public. In fact, they're better when they're not. In chapter 1 and verse 10, notice, he says to her, your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, your neck with chains of gold. Now to Solomon, this wasn't an unusual thing, and we would go, wow, silver and gold, he's going to drape her with it. Verse 11, the daughters of Jerusalem say to her, we will make you ornaments of gold with studs of silver. And you would say, wow, I can't afford that. That's not the point. Think about in Solomon's situation, that was a very small thing that he would be doing. He would be giving her gifts. But in effect, they were very small things compared to his vast wealth. And what it's about is more concerning the little signs of affection. Again, not just compliments, and not just gifts. You don't have to run out and buy her the most expensive thing in the jewelry store. Write her a poem. Hold hands, even when you think it might be awkward because people might be watching. Make a paper flower, and you say, well, I don't know how to do that. Learn origami. She will appreciate it because she appreciates the sentiment. She appreciates the attitude. She appreciates being considered. And frankly, the same goes in the other direction. I am hard to buy for. It is not because I have expensive taste. I don't really. It's because necessarily want anything. I'm very satisfied with my life and with what I have. And there are times where I like something, sure, but I'm really happy with where I'm at and the relationship as it is. So, but my wife does little things like what she just did a second ago. It means a lot to me that she marks my songbook, and sometimes I do it myself. And sometimes I intentionally don't mark my songbook because I know she already did. And then I ask her if I can have that songbook, and she gives it to me. And people looking at us wouldn't know anything, and that's okay. But I know. It's a little thing that she does that I appreciate, and there are 1,000 more. And part of it is learning to appreciate what one another does, and another is to continue those practices. If we spend as much time in developing our relationship with one another, that is our emotional and spiritual and psychological relationship with the one we love, we would have a whole lot better marriages. Especially if we put in as much effort as we did to get the person in the first place. Convince them that we were someone worth marrying, rather than waiting until the honeymoon is over and then reverting back to who we used to be before we were interested in this person. In fact, there's a story of a man who seeks a divorce from his wife, and he has found another love. He is sure that he is in love with her. I use that word very loosely. He's infatuated with this new individual because he has, in his mind, fallen out of love with this woman. And so he wants a divorce, and he doesn't want to pay alimony and all these things. And so she says, fine, but you're going to give me 6 months. And in those 6 months, I'm going to give you a series of things that you're going to do. And if you do these things over the next 6 months, then, and if you still want it at the end, then fine. And so he consents, because he's very interested in not having to pay alimony and split all the proceeds and whatever the case might be. And they were simple things like holding hands while we watch television. They were simple things like going out on a date once a week, spending time together, all kinds of simple things that he didn't find it difficult to do. But at the end of a few months, he discovered that he was no longer in love with this other woman. In fact, rediscovered that love that he had with this woman, his wife. Not because love is such a fickle thing. It's not a fickle thing. It's a decision that we make. It is sometimes a feeling that we have, but it needs to be a mindset that we live in. Little things mean a whole lot. Compliments, given well, mean a lot. And what we'll see here is that they help one another in their insecurities. That's hard to say. In their insecurities. We've already seen it on her part, but look at chapter 2 and verse 1, which is an interesting one. Chapter 2, verse 1 is she says, notice she's saying this, I am the rose of Sharon and the lily of the valleys. Now those probably sound pretty familiar to you, don't they? Those are song titles and or verses out of Psalms. And you might say, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. I thought the same thing at the time. And if, like so many people try to allegorize this, turn it into an allegory, that is to say that it's representative only of Jesus and the church, or God and his people, this doesn't make any sense at all, because to that, the church would be the lily of the valley. Because the Shulamite, she says, I'm the lily of the valley, I am the rose of Sharon. But the problem is that the metaphor works for her. Remember what the rose of Sharon or the lily of the valley is. It is a pretty wildflower. She says, sure, I might be attractive compared to the other country bumpkins. But she doesn't feel like she holds a candle to the loveliness that exists in Solomon's court. Of all these princesses that have spent all this time and energy and their family's money to be pretty and beautiful and to know all the court songs and the dances and all the things that would transpire, I am nothing compared to them. I might be pretty amongst other country people, but I don't hold a candle to them. And notice what he says in response. I love this. Like a lily among thorns is my love among the daughters. He says, you're so much more than that. Now, this tracks well, even though we sing songs about Jesus being the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star, that he is the rose of Sharon. That tracks because Jesus is special to the people who appreciate him. that he was not attractive in the traditional sense, that he had nothing about him that made him desirable by the people around him. And so it tracked perfectly well, and the songs are perfectly valid and beautiful songs, not just in vocals, but in meaning. But his whole point, the whole point here that the Shulamite is bringing out, remember back in verse 5, I am dark but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem. She starts describing herself as dark because, verse 6, the sun has tanned me, my mother's sons were angry with me, they made me keeper of the vineyards. So they gave her jobs that were out in the sun that did not allow her to keep pristine her appearances in the way that she would have liked, or the way the court decided in the haphazard way fashion is what was beautiful. But notice she says there at the end of verse 6, but my own vineyard I have not kept. She's not talking about a vineyard. She's talking about her beauty. I have not had the time and energy to invest and the money to invest in my beauty. When Solomon saw her, she was keeping vineyards out in the sun, and he saw her and he loved her. And then he sought to take her as his own wife. And so their relationship blossoms through the beginning of chapter 1. It develops as they get to know each other. And then look at chapter 2 and verse 3. Well, chapter 2 verse 3. Look at chapter 2 and verse 8. It says, the voice of my beloved, behold, he comes, leaping upon the mountains, skipping upon the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag. Behold, he stands behind our wall. He is looking through the windows, gazing through the lattice, looking for her. Now imagine, see, we sometimes get confused that because men are not the same as women, they're not, that men don't also need help affirming their masculinity and their insecurities. Imagine if you said this to your husband. How do you suppose he would feel? You compared him to a gazelle, a young stag, that you said to him, I think you are a very special creature, a very powerful person, one who is able to leap mountains and skip upon the hills. Now, it doesn't track as easily into the English because we have really weird concepts of masculinity and what a man is, which is pretty ridiculous, frankly. But it seems that people have always struggled with such things. But the point is, she's bringing out here, if you want your man to act like a man, there's a really good way of helping. Treat him like a man. And so often we get back to that criticism, that all we do is criticize each other and we talk about each other's defects rather than enhancing each other's benefits and the things that they do right. And there are so many of them here. And there's so much opportunity through the Song of Solomon to see how God appreciates the love between a husband and his wife. Even as hard as it is to watch young love. And God rejoices in it. And God appreciates it. But what happens, it's a really important thing, so we'll cover it here. What happens between chapters 1 and 2, it seems, are the consummation of their marriage. If you notice verses 15 through 17, they are talking back and forth about how amazing each other are. He says, behold, you are fair, my love. Behold, you are fair. You have dove's eyes. She comes back, behold, you are handsome, my beloved. Yes, pleasant also. Our bed is green, and the beams of our houses are cedar, and our rafters are fir. It's the escalation of the passion on their wedding night. And then in verse 3, there's an obvious euphemism there. Apples to the people of the time, to be fair, I am told, I'm not a scholar in these weird sort of things, but apples to the people of their time were erotic fruit that they considered helpful to the libido, as we would call it. And so they talk about apples regularly through the Song of Solomon. There in verse 3, we see it again as she asks for food. Verse 5, there in chapter 2, sustain me with cakes of raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am lovesick. Either so enraptured with him that it's making me dizzy, which I'm sure some of you have experienced, is so focused on another individual, but more precisely, or also it could be that she's sick after lovemaking, and she needs sustenance. And then she talks to her husband. Verse 6 there, his left hand is under my head, and his right hand embraces me. I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the does of the field, do not stir up nor awaken love until it pleases. There's a need to protect the marriage bed. The standard warning should be heeded. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 18 through 20. Paul, he says, flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? In fact, in the very next chapter, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul would argue that if you're married, your body's not your own anyway. It belongs to the other person, and not in a way that they should misuse it or take advantage of it, but that it should be willfully yielded to the other person. He describes, in a very apt way, the sexual relationship between a husband and wife. And the Shulamite warns of something else. Not necessarily something deeper or something greater or something more meaningful, because he's talking about sin. And you don't get more deep, or you don't get more important than sin. But she's going to talk about something that's going to cause a lot of people problems. In Elizabeth City, after I received permission from parents, I asked my teen class, we had a session on sexuality in the teen class. I asked them what was the worst consequence of premarital sex. And their answers probably wouldn't surprise you. Their answers were STDs, unintended pregnancies, loss of self-respect. That one did surprise me. I was very proud of that. Destruction of the relationship. One girl talked about the milk and the cow. Why should he buy a cow if he gets the milk for free? Which I never appreciated that analogy. It works, but it doesn't seem like one of those analogies you should use regularly, at least about any particular person. And I told them all no. I said every time they'd give something, if it wasn't the right answer, I told them no. No. And I don't know if you know what the worst consequence of premarital sex is. It's obvious from 1 Corinthians chapter 6. So many places in the New Testament, adultery is condemned. Sin. Sin is the worst consequence a Christian can endure, can deal with. But there are more than just STDs and unintentional pregnancies and loss of self-respect and destruction of relationship. What happens physically to two individuals who engage in a sexual relationship is that it creates a stronger than emotional connection to that partner. A stronger emotional connection to that partner. And that goes both ways. We might pretend that men are exempt from this, that young men can take care of this kind of thing and be purveyors and sow their seed wide, which is ridiculous. But it affects these people. And then it opens the door of your mind, which cannot be shut. Carelessly awakening passion and love and sexuality. And while it is at times uncomfortable to talk about, that is a topic that is worth talking about. When we're talking here, there in Song of Solomon chapter 2, if you notice again verse 7, she has concluded this night, this what we presume to be their first night together. And she comes to a realization. And the weird thing is she's going to say this same thing 3 times through the course of the book, 8 chapters. She says it 3 times. She's going to say, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem. She's warning the audience, because that's who the daughters of Jerusalem are in this case. She's warning the audience by the gazelles or by the does of the field. Do not stir up nor awaken love until it pleases. An alternate translation, one that seems more appropriate to the context of what's happening, until it's appropriate. Do not stir up love until it is appropriate. She suddenly realizes the effects that a sexual relationship has created in the two of them. And there are a lot of consequences. I mean, that was not an all-inclusive list of consequences, but she's going to give one. It is going to be harder to close that door. In fact, once you open the door of sexuality, you can't truly close it. Not in fact. It becomes very difficult to deal with. It becomes a nuisance, a problem in your life. And while I would encourage anyone who has previously been sexually active and outside of a marital relationship, people make a joke of it, but recreating your virginity is an absolutely valid thing to do. Recommitting to your relationship to God and to the marriage bed whenever that time potentially comes in the future is an absolutely valid and worthwhile opportunity. And while the world will make fun of it, they will make fun of a lot of really great ideas because they are really dumb and they're really annoying. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, it says, "Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge." And we have so many of these passages that talk about adultery and talk about fornication and the condemnation that comes with it. But we tend not to focus on the fact that God embraces and encourages a sexual relationship within the right context. And we can, at times, seem afraid of talking about sex. Probably because we feel awkward. Having that first discussion with a young person is not an easy thing. Your child. It's not an easy thing to do, but it is a necessary thing to do. We should protect the sexuality, we should protect sex before and after marriage. We should protect it like a precious work of art. And I know that sounds kind of weird. But the world thinks that Christians are afraid of sex. And I think sometimes we are. Partially so anyway. But when it comes to limiting a sexual relationship to the marriage bed, it is not because we are afraid of sex, but of what humans do to the beauty of an appropriate sexual relationship. There was a metaphor, Matt Walsh used it, and I thought it was incredibly apt. He asked a question of a bunch of people. Well, his was a general question to people who believe that sex should be limitless, that you should be able to be promiscuous in every way possible and don't respect the consequences of those actions. He asked, why do we put works of art on the walls of museums with security systems and guards? Is it because we're afraid those works of art will jump off the wall and hurt people? Or are we afraid that people will hurt the beauty of the art that's on that wall? What has humanity done with everything they've touched? They've mutilated it, and they've morphed it into what they want, and they have made it into something that God did not intend it to be. Because we keep the work of art safe from the people. That's what those things are for. And what Christians are trying to do, and what the Jews hopefully tried to do before, they didn't do a terribly great job. Obviously, Solomon was a terrible example of this principle later on in his life. But what we find in this woman, in this incredible sense, is the confirmation here in chapter 2, verse 7, chapter 3, verse 5, chapter 4, verse 8, that human sexuality has consequences, emotional consequences leading forward. And that while we might only focus in the moment, what we need to be focusing on are the consequences that come much later. How is your relationship with your husband going to be, or your wife going to be later on if you've been promiscuous at a younger age? Is it possible that they will wonder if you are comparing your experiences with them and your experiences with others? Well, you know what's great? If this is the only person, if it's possible that this is the case, how great would it be if this was the only person you ever had a sexual experience with? Then they are your best partner ever. And they don't have to worry about comparisons, and you don't have to reassure them in that way. You are both, hopefully and potentially, new to this. But we open the door to a lot of problems when we begin, and the world has been pushing this for a very long time, sexual exploits. And when we do not respect the marriage bed, and when sometimes even we, as Christians, become, frankly, afraid to talk about such things because it's awkward, because we don't like to. And the truth is, the Bible is explicit not only about the condemnation, but is explicit about the joy that's available in marriage, and how we should protect that marriage bed before and after the wedding. How we as individuals, as Christians, if we're not married, should look forward to that night, or that day, whatever, and how we as Christians should encourage other people to do the same. And The world doesn't like that because it's not what the world wants. And this wasn't terribly comfortable to talk about, but needed to be talked about, not only because it's in the Bible, which I think is a great enough excuse to do anything. If it's in the Bible, we should do it. But more importantly, because it is so incredibly timely that the world that we live in is trying to convince us of many things, but one of them is to reject the common and traditional concept of marriage. And we ought not do that. The Bible, God, knows what He's doing. And what we find in the world is chaos, is problems upon problems upon problems that don't begin even with sexually transmitted diseases and undesired pregnancies in the moment, but have incredibly long-lasting consequences that many individuals who have participated in this kind of activity are only now discovering. But what we've discovered is God's way is best. And if you can do it God's way, then you should. We should all be partakers of the will of God. And it is not that He does not want us to understand or commit ourselves to a sexual relationship, but to do so within the bonds of marriage, where it can be appreciated and cultivated and enjoyed most perfectly. We have an opportunity to please God in the most perfect way possible, in our obedience, in our faithfulness to Him, not only in adultery or fornication and not going into that, not being indulged by that, but more importantly by obeying Him in every possible conception, of not giving in when temptation strikes, and in fact preparing ourselves for temptation even before it comes. And this is another that I'm not going to get into now because it's safe for a future lesson, but we'll talk about it just momentarily. Preparing for things like this, situations where you might be alone with the opposite sex, or individuals that may encourage you or push you to be promiscuous. Limiting your access to people like that, or times where you might be alone in situations like that, is not a silly thing. It is a smart thing. And it is things that we should do. Smarter still is to become a child of God, commit your life to Him. If you have need of becoming that child of God tonight, because you've made mistakes in your past, you are not alone. We all have. We have all made grievous mistakes. The righteousness that we bear is as filthy rags. The best we can do is dirt, sand. But the Lord has offered us greater promises in His Son, greater opportunities to be His. And if we will be obedient, we can have them. If we're willing to repent, as Peter tells those on the day of Pentecost, repent and let every one of them be baptized for the remission of sins. They'll receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. They could walk anew and they could be joined with Christ. Or maybe you have walked away from Him and you've walked into some sin or temptation. Trials have dragged you away. Or more precisely, you've walked away towards them. We can help. We can help you return